Alright, in this video we're going to talk about while loop. First of all, open this file named whileloopexample.java, and in that you will see this syntax. You must probably be seeing the code written already. What I would suggest is you get rid of the code and try to write from scratch along with me. Now this is the syntax we use for while loop. We had already talked about while loop in the beginning of this chapter when I explained it on the whiteboard. Now this is the syntax. We use the word while and then the expression. This expression should result in a Boolean value. If this expression results in false, then we're going to come out of this loop. If this expression is true, then we're going to get inside this block and execute this set of statements. We keep on entering this block and execute whatever the statements are inside this till the condition is not met or till the condition becomes false. Now let's take a look at one good example of while loop. I'm going to consider the same example we've talked about in the beginning of the chapter, the robot example. What we're going to do here is the robot will try to attempt to start the car with max attempts of 10. If it succeeds before 10 attempts, then we're going to get out of this loop. Let's see how it goes. Again, we're going to be needing the user to give some input. Let me paste that code here. Let me fix the error. In addition to these 3 lines of code, we also have a couple of variables defined. The max attempts is the maximum number of attempts that the robot will try to start the car, after which it will simply give up. And count is something that we're going to use in our logic. This is basically to keep track on the number of attempts happened. The attempts is something that the user will give, which actually tells the logic in how many attempts will the car start. In order to save your time, let me copy paste the code. Let's do Alt-Shift-F so that the code will have proper indentation. So first of all, let's talk about these 2 blocks in here. We have an if condition and it will check to see if count is equals to attempts. If this condition is met, that means the car is going to start. So we're going to send a message saying robot successfully started the car in count attempts, number of attempts. We use the keyword break to break out of this while loop. We had already talked about the keyword break earlier in this chapter. Now we have another condition. It will check to see if count is equals max attempts. That means robot tried maximum allowable number of times and then it needed to give up. So we're going to print the message robot has failed to start the car. And automatically we're going to come out of this loop. We don't have to use the word break here because this condition will become false and we're going to get out of this loop. Now this is the post increment operator. Every time we enter inside this block while loop, we're going to keep incrementing this count just to keep track on number of attempts happening. And that's it. Let's try to run the program. In how many attempts will the car start? Let's say 13. Note that 13 is greater than the maximum attempts. So ideally, the robot should give up trying in 10 attempts. Let's see the output. Let's press return or hit enter. And if you see, let's expand this by double clicking it. Robot indeed tried 10 times. Robot is attempting to start the car, and we see that message 10 times. Finally, we displayed the message that says robot has failed to start the car. That's because we gave 13 here, because the car is going to start in 13 attempts, which is greater than the max attempts. Now let's give another try. This time I'm going to give 3. I'm going to tell the logic that the car will start in 3 attempts. Let's hit enter. So the robot tried 3 times, and after the 3rd attempt it has succeeded. Robot successfully started the car in 3 attempts. Of course, this program doesn't make a lot of sense, but in real world programming, it's not human who's going to give this value. It will be dependent on the machine logics, which is pretty complicated, way out of the scope of this chapter. So the intention here is to explain the while loop, and I hope you understood what it is and what we're doing here. We have another construct called do while loop. Let's see what it is. The do while loop has the following syntax. The only difference between while loop and do while loop is we execute the statements at least once before checking the condition. Now in this chapter, maybe in next video, we're going to talk about how it makes sense to use do while loop instead of the while loop. But for now, let us try to understand what do while loop is. I'm going to use the exact same piece of code in here and make little amendments. Let's copy this code and paste it over here. The only difference here is we need to take out this while condition, Control X, and paste it over here and use the keyword called do. And this statement, this is a statement, and we end this with a semicolon. Alright, we're good. Now this will do more or less the same thing what we have seen in the while loop example, but the difference is without checking the condition, we're going to execute this block of statements at least once. If you run the program, you would pretty much can expect the same results as to that of this program. Again, we'll talk about the differences between the while loop and the do while loop. We'll understand when to use do while loop and when to use while loop, etc. Now we have another looping construct. Let's see what it is. It's called the for loop. The for loop does more or less the same job what while loop does, except it will look more compact and improve the readability. And not just that, there are some additional advantages with for loop, and definitely sometimes it makes sense to use while loop instead of for loop, and vice versa. We're going to talk about it in our next video. But for loop has the following syntax. It has initialization. In here we'll initialize a variable, the termination or the expression that would result in either true or false, and then increment and decrement statement. Let me show you with an example. I'm going to use the same code which I had used in the while loop. Sorry. I'm going to copy this and paste it over here. I press Alt Shift F to give proper indentation. First thing is to change this keyword while to for, and we're going to get rid of the count variable from here and put it in here. Let's get rid of this, and we'll also get rid of this post increment of count, Control X, and paste it over here, separating with a semicolon. So this is it. This is exactly how for loop looks like. Now this will do exact same job what while loop did. If you run the program, you would see the same results. Let's run the program. I would say 3, the same results. So for loop looks more compact and more readable. So now that we have learned 3 different looping constructs, In our next video, we're gonna see when to use which looping construct. In this video, we're gonna take a look at the differences between for loop, while loop, and do while loop, and we're gonna understand when to use which looping construct and depending on what circumstances. Obviously, you can always use while loop instead of for loop, and you can even use for loop instead of while loop, but it's always advisable that you follow best practices. As a rule of thumb, always try to use for loop instead of while loop whenever applicable. One reason for that is it looks a lot cleaner and more readable. For example, you write your program today and you come back on this code a year after, and you will thank yourself that you had used for loop because it looks a lot cleaner, and you'll get a glimpse of what this loop is doing just by looking at this line of code, because this line of code has all the major statements that will define this loop. Now, just by looking at this statement, we're going to say that we're going to loop through this block of statements again and again for n number of times. In this case, it's array.length, the length of an array. So we're going to loop through this for loop 5 times. If you would have used while loop, then all these 3 statements must have been scattered around. And let's say you forget to define this, or you forget to increment the counter, then we will lose the track on number of iterations, and hence the logic will result in infinite loop. So there is a chance that you're gonna miss one of these statements and break the code. We can minimize that using for loop. So now that's one major big difference. So it's always advisable that you use for loop instead of while loop whenever possible. So what else could be the reason where you need to use for loop instead of while loop? Is when you know ahead of time how many times you're going to loop through these statements. By that I mean, if we run this program during the compile time itself, the compiler will be able to figure out how many times it needs to enter this block of code. And since the compiler knows ahead of time, it's going to make copy of this set of statements inside this block. In this case is just one statement. That way it will make the job easier for the JVM to run the program. So that will improve the performance aspect as well. Not much though. And another good reason why you need to use for loop is because of the lines of code. The lines of code will decrease if you use for loop instead of while loop. Obviously, because all the statements will be scattered around multiple lines, and in this case it's just in one line. Just for your information, lines of code is one of the metrics used to evaluate the quality of the code. Now we have while loop. So when to use while loop? You can use while loop when you don't know ahead of time how many times you're going to loop through the statements. For example, take a look at this example. If you wanted to maintain a backup files from your local PC to a remote server, then you need to have a logic that looks somewhat like this. You're going to say while true, okay, and then you come inside that block, and if new file is present in your local directory, then copy that file to the backup server, and we'll wait for 1 hour. So what this piece of code is essentially doing is this code is running forever. When we say while true, that means the condition will always be true, and we're going to enter this block again and again every 1 hour, because we have a timer set to 1 hour here. And every 1 hour we're going to check to see if there are any new files added in your directory, and if so, if there's a new file present, then we're going to take a backup by copying the file to the remote server. So this is one place where you want to use the while loop instead of for loop. During compile time, we don't know how many times we're going to loop through, because in this case it's just infinite. User have to terminate it manually, or you will have to have a condition here that says stop this operation after say 1 or 2 years, and we need to break out of this loop. Another reason why you want to use while loop is when you are say copying a text from a file to another file. Then we're going to loop through and copy each and every line till the end of file is reached, or till there are no lines left. So if it is not end of file, that means there are still lines to be copied. Copy that particular line. Again, we're going to come back here and check if we reached end of file. If not, go to the next line and copy that line to our destination file. Obviously, we don't know ahead of time how many times we're going to loop through. We don't know how many lines of text is present in the source file. In this case, it just makes sense to use while loop. Let's take a look at another good example. The while true statement will be used very often in animation field. For example, whenever you play any game, if you're seeing a moving character, chances are that they would have used the while loop construct in this manner. We will have a while loop true, that means this is going to be an infinite loop, and we're gonna say keep walking. You got a cartoon character walking or whatever, and when the user presses exit or maybe escape key or control C or whatever is the key to get out of the game, or maybe to quit the game, will break out of the loop as well. So this is another logic where you want to use while loop instead of for loop. And obviously, as I've mentioned, you can use for loop instead of while loop even here, but it makes more sense to use while loop here. So always use for loop when you know ahead of time how many times we're going to loop through. If you don't know, then use while loop. And I gave you some examples on when to use while loop. Now we have a do while loop. As we had discussed, it's going to perform the action first, or execute the block of statements, and then we'll check the condition. One good reason why you want to use do while loop is demonstrated here. What we're doing here is we're going to take the input from the user, and we're going to check to see if the user entered number is in the multiples of 10. If so, we'll quit out of this program, or we'll get out of this loop. If not, we're going to ask him again to enter a number which is in the multiples of 10. Try to accomplish the same thing with while loop. First of all, let's see how this runs. I'm going to enter some value, say 8. Now 8 is not a numerical in the multiples of 10, so let's hit enter. We're going to get prompted with this message once again to enter a number which is multiples of 10. Let's enter 88, or let's say 85, and let's enter 90. Now this should get us out of the loop. It did. Now try to accomplish the same thing with while loop. Chances are that it will get either complicated or not possible.